There is a Japanese principle that samurai practiced before stepping onto the battlefield. Not a technique, not a strategy, but a way of relating to progress itself. When this principle was absent, a warrior didn't lose because his enemy was stronger. He lost because hesitation entered his movement. Today, we live in the age of information. Courses, mentors, strategies, data, analysis, everything is within reach. Yet the more we see how fast others are moving, the harder it becomes to take the next step ourselves. Not because we lack knowledge, but because something essential is missing. Subscribe, like, comment where comparison holds you back. The false belief system. Most people believe comparison hurts because it makes them feel inferior. That's not the real damage. The real damage happens earlier, when society quietly teaches you how progress is supposed to look. From a young age, you're shown timelines, benchmarks, milestones. By a certain age, you should be here. By now, you should have figured it out. And when you don't match those invisible schedules, something inside you tightens. You begin to assume the problem is personal. You tell yourself quiet sentences you never say out loud. Maybe I'm slower than others. Maybe I missed my window. Maybe I don't have what they have. This is how shame works in modern life. Not loudly, not cruelly, but persistently. It convinces intelligent, capable people that doubt is evidence, that hesitation means incapacity, that seeing others move faster means you are falling behind. But none of that is true. What you're reacting to isn't reality. It's a distorted measuring system. You're comparing outcomes without seeing context. You're comparing speed without understanding rhythm. You're comparing someone else's visible result to your own invisible process. And because society rewards visible progress, you learn to distrust what can't be seen yet. Slow improvement feels like failure. Silence feels like stagnation. Patience feels like weakness. So you push harder, you consume more information, you watch more people who seem ahead. And without realizing it, comparison doesn't motivate you, it paralyzes you. Not because you're incapable, but because you've been trained to believe that progress only counts when it looks like someone else's. And once that belief settles in, taking the next small step feels pointless.
Silent impatience. His name is Daniel. He is not someone people worry about. Daniel is 32. He works a steady job in an office that looks exactly like thousands of others. Clean desks, neutral walls, screens glowing from morning until evening. He wakes up at the same time every day, commutes without complaint, completes his tasks, replies to emails, attends meetings, pays his bills on time. By all visible standards, Daniel is doing fine. He is responsible, hardworking, dependable. He doesn't skip work. He doesn't waste his days. He doesn't wait around for motivation. And yet, beneath the surface, something is constantly tightening. Daniel's days follow a rhythm that never quite changes. Morning coffee, work, lunch at his desk, more work, commute home, dinner, a few quiet hours before sleep. Nothing is wrong with this routine. That's what makes it unsettling. Because despite doing everything he's supposed to do, Daniel feels as if time is passing without asking him for permission. The exhaustion he feels isn't physical, it's mental. A low-level tension that never fully leaves. A sense that effort is being spent, but direction is unclear. During breaks, Daniel scrolls. Not aimlessly, intentionally. He follows people who talk about progress, career growth, learning new skills, building something meaningful. At first, it feels inspiring, but slowly,
Inspiration turns into measurement. Daniel doesn't compare talent, he compares timelines. Someone his age has already changed careers. Another has built something on the side. Another seems confident, certain, ahead. Daniel doesn't resent them, he admires them. But admiration quietly becomes pressure. He looks at his own progress and feels an uncomfortable question forming. Why doesn't this feel like enough? He rarely says his dreams out loud, not because they're unrealistic, but because once spoken, they invite comparison. He wants to grow beyond his current role. He wants to feel capable, not just reliable. He wants to build something that belongs to him. But each time he considers taking a step, he notices how far others seem to have already gone, and that awareness changes everything. His actions become cautious, measured, delayed. Daniel tells himself he's being strategic, that waiting is smart, that more preparation will make the next move safer. But deep down, he knows the truth. He isn't waiting because he's unready. He's waiting because he's uncertain. Uncertain whether his pace is acceptable. Uncertain whether his direction is valid. Uncertain whether moving slowly means moving incorrectly. So he keeps going, but without urgency. Working, but not committing. Planning, but not deciding. Consuming information, but hesitating to act. Daniel isn't stuck because he lacks discipline. He's stuck because comparison has quietly entered his process. Not loudly, not dramatically, silently. And that silent impatience, the feeling of constantly being behind without knowing why, is what keeps him exactly where he is.
The moment doesn't arrive dramatically. There's no argument, no failure announcement, no public embarrassment. It happens on an ordinary evening. Daniel is sitting alone at his desk at home, laptop open, lights dimmed. He's watching a presentation replay from earlier that day, a project update delivered by a colleague a few years younger than him. The presentation isn't extraordinary, clear, confident, focused. But something about it unsettles Daniel. Not the quality of the work, the certainty behind it. As the video ends, Daniel pauses the screen. He realizes something that makes his chest tighten. He could have done that project. He had the skills, he understood the material, but he never volunteered. Not because he was incapable, but because he wasn't sure it was the right moment. He replays the last few months in his mind, the meetings where he stayed quiet, the ideas he refined privately but never shared, the opportunities he watched pass by because someone else moved first. And suddenly, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Daniel hasn't been losing because he's behind. He's been losing because he hesitates. He stands up and walks to the kitchen, restless. Pours a glass of water he doesn't drink, leans against the counter, staring at nothing. A question surfaces, not accusatory, not dramatic, just painfully clear. When did I stop trusting my own pace? Daniel realizes he's been measuring every step against invisible timelines, checking his movement against others before committing to it. And each time he does, something subtle breaks. Confidence drains, decisions weaken, action stalls. The worst part isn't that he feels behind, it's that he recognizes himself as someone who waits while others move. Not because they're better, but because they don't pause the way he does. That recognition hits harder than any failure, because it's not about skill or knowledge or discipline, it's about identity. Daniel sees the gap between who he believes he is, capable, thoughtful, disciplined, and how he actually behaves under pressure. He returns to his desk and sits down slowly.
The room feels quieter than before. And in that quiet, a realization settles in. I'm not the person I thought I was. Not because he lacks ability, but because he's allowed comparison to interrupt his movement before action ever begins. That night, Daniel doesn't make a plan. He doesn't promise change. He simply sits with the discomfort. Because for the first time, he's not distracted by someone else's progress. He's facing his own hesitation, clearly, honestly, without excuses.
After that night, Daniel doesn't ignore the discomfort. He does what most disciplined, intelligent people do when they realize something isn't working. He looks for solutions, not impulsively, carefully. He starts with information, podcasts during his commute, articles saved for later, videos promising clarity, strategy, direction. At first, it feels productive. Each piece of content offers language for what he's feeling, frameworks, models, explanations that sound precise. Daniel takes notes, highlights passages, bookmarks moments that seem important. He tells himself he's preparing. Soon, preparation turns into optimization. He signs up for a course, then another. One focused on productivity, another on career leverage, another on building something on the side. None of them are scams, none of them are useless. They're reasonable, well-structured, taught by people who appear confident and composed. Daniel completes the modules, checks the boxes, feels brief satisfaction when lessons are finished. But something strange happens. Despite consuming more information than ever, his behavior doesn't change. He understands more, but moves no faster. When a new opportunity appears, Daniel pauses. He reviews what he's learned, considers multiple approaches, waits for the right version of himself to act. And while he's waiting, someone else moves. Again. This doesn't frustrate him immediately. It confuses him, because he's doing everything correctly, at least on paper. He's disciplined, consistent, serious about improvement, yet progress remains abstract. Daniel notices a pattern forming. The more he learns, the heavier each decision feels. Action no longer feels simple. It feels loaded. If he acts too soon, he risks choosing wrong. If he acts too slowly, he falls further behind. So he chooses a third option. He delays. Not openly, not intentionally. He reframes hesitation as strategy, indecision as patience, consumption as preparation. But deep down, he knows what's happening. Information has become a shield, a way to stay busy without risking movement, a way to feel engaged without exposing himself to comparison again. Because once he acts, his pace becomes visible, and visibility invites judgment from others and from himself. Daniel isn't failing because he lacks motivation. He isn't stuck because he's lazy. He's stuck because every solution he's trying still depends on measuring himself against external standards, metrics, benchmarks, timelines he didn't choose. And as long as improvement is defined externally, action will always feel unsafe. Eventually, a quiet realization surfaces. The problem isn't effort, and it isn't knowledge. The problem is the approach. Daniel has been trying to fix comparison with more comparison, just dressed up as strategy. And without realizing it, every reasonable solution he's chosen has pulled him further away from his own rhythm.
Daniel doesn't discover the idea through a breakthrough moment. There's no sudden clarity, no dramatic insight. It arrives quietly. One evening, while searching for something entirely different, he stumbles upon a short passage about the way samurai trained before battle. Not how they fought, not how they won, but how they prepared. What strikes Daniel isn't the discipline, it's the restraint. These warriors didn't rush to match one another's speed. They didn't synchronize their training to the strongest man in the room. They trained according to an internal rhythm, one that couldn't be rushed without breaking it. Daniel pauses. He realizes something uncomfortable. Every problem he's been trying to solve has been treated as a problem of effort. Move faster, learn more, optimize harder. But the old texts weren't concerned with speed at all. They warned that the most dangerous moment was when a warrior allowed external movement to interrupt his own. When that happened, the body didn't feel, the mind did. Daniel sees the pattern immediately. Each time he compared himself to others, his attention shifted outward. Each time his attention shifted outward, his movement hesitated. And every solution he tried afterward was an attempt to recover confidence without addressing that interruption. He thought he needed better systems, better strategies, more certainty. But the samurai writings suggested something else entirely. Before action, there must be space. Before speed, there must be steadiness. Before progress, there must be trust in one's own rhythm. Daniel recognizes the irony. In trying to move correctly, he's been preventing himself from moving at all. Because the moment action depends on comparison, it stops being action. It becomes performance, and performance always demands an audience. The insight settles slowly. He doesn't need to outrun anyone. He doesn't need to validate his pace. He doesn't need to justify his progress. He needs to protect the internal conditions that allow movement to continue uninterrupted. For the first time, Daniel understands why discipline alone never worked. Discipline can force action, but it cannot restore rhythm once it's broken. What he's been missing isn't willpower. It's the principle that allows action to emerge without interference, without comparison, without urgency, without the constant need to measure. And once that principle is seen, everything else becomes secondary. The courses, the frameworks, the timelines, they were never the problem. They were distractions from something much simpler and far more difficult to maintain. Daniel makes a mistake at first. He assumes what he's discovered is another idea to apply, another concept to add to the collection, another tool to use when things feel stuck. But the more he sits with it, the clearer it becomes. This isn't something you use, it's something you organize your life around. The samurai principle he encountered was never meant to improve outcomes, it was meant to protect continuity. Once Daniel sees this, the structure begins to form, not as a plan, but as an operating system. First, mindset. Progress is no longer judged by speed, it's judged by consistency. If he moves today, the system works. If he hesitates because of comparison, the system breaks. Second, process. Action doesn't require certainty, it requires alignment. Daniel stops asking whether a step is optimal. He asks whether it keeps him moving without interruption. Third, pace. The goal is not acceleration. The goal is sustainability. Any rhythm that forces him to look sideways is rejected, no matter how impressive it appears. Fourth, purpose. Movement is no longer about catching up. It's about maintaining a relationship with his own path. This changes everything. Tasks feel lighter, not because they're easier, but because they no longer carry the weight of comparison. Decisions feel simpler, not because he knows more, but because fewer external voices are involved. Daniel realizes why this system couldn't be reduced to advice. Advice tells you what to do. This system tells you what to ignore. Ignore timelines you didn't choose. Ignore speed you didn't earn. Ignore progress that demands performance instead of presence. For the samurai, this separation was survival.
Once attention fractured, the blade followed. In modern life, the consequences look quieter, but they are just as real. Fragmented attention leads to fragmented effort. Fragmented effort leads to stalled progress. Daniel finally understands the difference between discipline and alignment. Discipline pushes through resistance. Alignment removes the resistance before it appears. And for the first time in a long time, movement begins to feel natural again. Not fast, not impressive, just uninterrupted.
Daniel doesn't change his life overnight. In fact, from the outside, almost nothing seems different. He doesn't announce new goals. He doesn't redesign his routine. He doesn't increase his workload. Instead, he introduces one quiet rule. Every day, there must be a small movement forward. So small, it barely feels like progress. Some days, it's 15 minutes of focused work without checking anything else. Some days, it's refining a single idea instead of planning 10. Some days, it's simply showing up without expecting momentum. At the end of each day, Daniel writes one sentence. Not a result, not a victory, just a note about what moved, even slightly. At first, this feels unsatisfying. There's no rush, no visible improvement, no sense of acceleration. But Daniel recognizes these thoughts. They are the same voices that used to interrupt his movement before it began. So instead of responding, he lets them pass. The practice isn't about silencing doubt. It's about not letting doubt dictate direction. Days turn into weeks. Nothing dramatic happens. No breakthrough, no external validation, no sudden confidence. And yet, something subtle shifts. Action no longer feels heavy. Starting feels simpler. Stopping feels unnecessary. Because Daniel isn't asking whether his progress is impressive. He's asking whether it exists. The 1% rule does something comparison never could. It makes progress personal, invisible to others, unimpressive by design, sustainable by nature. And for the first time, Daniel notices that he's no longer waiting for the perfect moment to act. He's already moving, quietly, consistently, without needing permission from anyone else's pace. The change doesn't announce itself. Daniel doesn't wake up one morning feeling transformed. There's no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. What changes is quieter than that. Weeks pass, then months. Daniel notices that starting no longer feels heavy. Decisions that once required long internal debates now take shape without resistance. He speaks up in meetings, not more loudly, just more steadily. Ideas are shared before they're perfect. Work moves forward without waiting for reassurance. There's no surge of confidence, but there is less friction. Tasks that once felt draining now feel neutral, sometimes even satisfying. Daniel's attention stays where his feet are. He still sees others moving fast, still notices milestones he hasn't reached, but the sight no longer disrupts him. Comparison still appears, but it no longer decides anything. Because Daniel's progress is no longer theoretical, it's embodied. He can point to small, concrete movements, notes written, skills refined, decisions made without delay. None of it looks impressive from the outside, but together it compounds. The most unexpected change isn't productivity, it's emotional stability. Daniel no longer oscillates between urgency and self-doubt. There's a steadiness to his days now, a sense of continuity. He trusts that tomorrow will build on today, not because of optimism, but because he's seen it happen. And slowly, a quiet confidence forms. Not the kind that demands recognition, the kind that doesn't need it. Daniel realizes something important. The reason this change feels real is because it never relied on motivation. It relied on protection. protection of rhythm, protection of attention, protection of movement from interruption. Nothing about his life looks dramatically different, but he knows, with a certainty that doesn't need comparison, that he is no longer stuck, because he's no longer measuring himself against anyone else's pace. He's measuring continuity, and continuity over time always wins.
Daniel doesn't think of himself as someone who fixed his life. That language no longer fits. What changed wasn't a result, it was a relationship. He no longer relates to progress as something to prove. He relates to it as something to maintain. There was a time when Daniel measured himself by how far he had come compared to others. Every achievement felt temporary. Every delay felt like failure. Now, those measurements feel irrelevant. He doesn't wake up asking, "How do I catch up today?" He asks something quieter. "Did I keep my rhythm?" This single question changes everything. It removes urgency without removing movement. It removes comparison without removing ambition. Daniel no longer waits to feel ready. Readiness is no longer emotional. Action has become a practice, something repeated regardless of mood. He notices that motivation appears more often now, but it's no longer required, because his identity has shifted. He isn't someone trying to get somewhere. He is someone who practices moving. This makes setbacks smaller, interruptions shorter, doubt less convincing. When progress slows, it no longer threatens who he is, because slowing down doesn't mean stopping, and stopping doesn't mean failing. Daniel understands what the samurai understood long ago. Victory wasn't found in speed, it was found in continuity. To practice was to advance. To protect rhythm was to endure. And endurance, over time, outlasts talent, urgency, and noise. Daniel hasn't arrived anywhere final, but he no longer feels behind, because he's no longer chasing outcomes. He's walking a path.
There is no finish line at the end of this story. No moment where everything suddenly becomes easy. No promise that comparison will disappear forever. You will still see others moving faster. You will still feel moments of doubt. That is part of being human. The difference is what you do next. You can return to measuring yourself against noise, or you can protect your rhythm. You can keep chasing speed, or you can keep walking. The samurai didn't wait for certainty. They didn't wait to feel confident. They moved because movement itself was the discipline. If something in this story felt familiar, that's not coincidence. It's recognition. You don't need to change everything. You don't need to move faster. You don't need to look sideways. You only need to take the next step without abandoning it to comparison. And then the next, quietly, consistently. That is how paths are walked.